there are actually 624 days, 3 hours and 52 minutes until the opening of the Tokyo 2020 Olympic Games, and as such, athletes around the world, including Singapore, are striving to push their boundaries with the assistance of sports science. Key considerations include the debutante athlete who is seeking to gain a training edge and accelerated adaptations in both body and mind before they step onto the world stage for the first time. And there will, of course, unfortunately, be casualties as these athletes push their boundaries with injury risk high. You know, we ask the question, how do we manage an injured athlete back to full health and fitness? And if preparing for an Olympic performance is not hard enough, Tokyo 2020 is predicted to be the hottest Olympics on record. And so how do our athletes beat the heat and perhaps even harness this heat stress as a training tool? So with these three questions in mind, our three experts by now need no further introduction. We've all met them and heard from them over the last 2 days. Dr. Shona Halson, recovery and sleep expert, formerly of AIS and now Associate Professor at the Australian Catholic University, Professor Andrew Kilding, whom we just heard from, performance physiologist, HBSNZ, and Dr. John Sullivan, whom we heard from yesterday, clinical sports psychologist with an extensive background in high-performance environments, including American football and NASA, alongside his academic position at the University of Rhode Island. So, folks, we have our three questions. We have our three experts on the stage. I think we tuck into this one. I was talking with John earlier about how there is an emerging trend to have these sort of live organic conversations on stage, and for the scientist and the expert, you know, it's really quite enjoyable, and for the audience, you know, we really hope that you enjoy this too. This is where, you know, the real learning can occur. John was telling me how, you know, humans have evolved through storytelling and naturally dialing into, you know, to a conversational tone. So hopefully it turns out like we designed it, eh? Yeah. I'm going to run out of hands here, I can tell. Shona, actually I'd like to start with you, if I may. And rather than talking about training and wrecking the body, because, you know, athletes right around the world are now desperately trying to get as fit as they possibly humanly can, and totally destroying themselves in the process. And when I reflect about our athletes here in Singapore, under recovery is a really, really big issue. So I just wonder what your thoughts might be in terms of, you know, what should we really be thinking about with regards to the recovery curve? What are some of those important points?
Yeah, that's a great question, and hopefully I can do justice with a decent answer. But I think there's a lot of factors that come into play, and I think one of the things that we're focusing on now is how we periodise recovery. So while we periodise training, we periodise nutrition, how are we thinking about periodising recovery? So what strategies do we do in which particular parts of the training block, and how can we maximise our adaptation? So we're not thinking about, you know, this far out from Tokyo, many people are not really thinking about competition per se. They are, but they aren't. What they're working on now is trying to drive that adaptation with the training days that we've got left. So for us, you know, really, we're thinking around what are some of the things that we can do to help understand what things our athletes need to recover with. You know, we typically do a lot of water immersion strategies, which will work for us, we think, with the environmental temperatures that we'll be experiencing in Tokyo. We look at things like compression garments. We work with soft tissue therapy. We link in with our dietitians. We trying to do more and more around the mental side of recovery. But what we're really trying to focus on is how do we periodise recovery so that we're not doing not enough recovery, but we're not also doing too much recovery. So, thank you, Rico. So basically, I mean, this is just an example of, say, how I might think about periodising water immersion, and this would be, for an example, maybe track cycling. And so what you see is you may have, if we go up the top, we may have cold water immersion there in our base endurance phase, where we might not do any. We might just let them drive that adaptation, let them train hard, let them put in the kilometres on the road, and let's just work those energy systems that are specific to that area, and maybe we don't need any recovery. But as we're moving through to the increase in track sessions or increase in volume that you might see where the guys and girls are getting into the track a little bit more, we might throw a little bit more recovery in there. And then when they get into the higher quality sessions that are required, so when coach wants, high quality short sharp sessions, then we want them to be as fresh as possible for those. So what we might be doing there is making sure that they're recovered for those particular sessions. And then when it comes to competition, so when it comes to games times, I would be suggesting that they pretty much do every recovery strategy that works for them and that is available for them. When it comes to hot water immersion, so now we're seeing warm water or hot water being used in the recovery period. Now, I wouldn't say always it's a recovery strategy. I think there are times when it is and it's nice and it's relaxing, and there's other times at the end of the continuum where it's stressful. And it can potentially be used to drive adaptations as a passive stressor. So in that instance, we may do the opposite in terms of our periodization. I may not include it in a competition environment in somewhere like Tokyo where it's hot already and it's just potentially going to cause them more passive heat stress, so take it away, but maybe we can use it in the earlier blocks to try and drive some of that adaptation. So while the hot water immersion might be used in a recovery period, doesn't mean exactly that it's a recovery strategy per se, depending on how you're actually using it. If you could go to the next one, Rico. No, that's all right, that one will do. I also had maybe I didn't include it, but an example of what periodization of recovery might look like for a team sport like rugby. Totally different. They're playing every week, they're getting beaten up, they're potentially travelling a lot, they're sore. We want to use recovery throughout the season as much as possible, because it's not so much adapting when you're talking about a rugby season, it's about being as good as you can every single week. So I think how we think about recovery and what strategies we use and how we periodise them very much depends on the sport and the time of the year and the particular goals at that time.
Shona, thanks. Andy, if I just move along to you, you can't have yin without yang. Stress and recovery, it's a counterbalance seesaw, isn't it? So from your perspective, in terms of athletes really increasing the niggle to increase the the adaptation, from you, and anything that our athletes can do a little special, a little different between now and Tokyo?
Yeah, I mean, there's no substitute for hard work, and we do push athletes pretty hard. I think a couple of things which have come out on, I think that show some potential for athletes who've been maybe around a while and are just looking for that little bit of extra edge. Altitude training, per se has been around quite a while. There's a lot of evidence, there was responders, non-responders, and, coaches have preference for and against it. But certainly some of the work that's come out of the French research groups in terms of using hypoxic training in kind of, a more acute sense, to kind of augment some of those physiological adaptations. So just putting athletes into hypoxia for a repeat sprint session is showing some quite nice responses. So I think if an athlete hasn't tried doing that, it doesn't need to go away for 3 weeks to altitude to get some of the kind of potential adaptation responses in terms of the hypoxic response. Another thing is using resistance training in hypoxia as well, and that kind of links in with my next one. Is using hypoxic stimulus as an augmenter of for strength gains, and that kind of leads into kind of where I kind of left off in my presentation, looking at the kind of the occlusion from an acute perspective as a priming strategy. If you occlude the limbs, more chronically, and look at blood flow restriction during a training session, then there's starting to be some kind of quite strong evidence to suggest that that's another, ergogenic approach to enhance certainly muscle hypertrophy and strength. And the research in endurance and kind of those kind of shorter endurance events is not quite there yet. But it's fair. I expect some papers in the certainly this year and next year, to start to drip feed out. I know research groups who are working on this, in that using occlusion as a
We were meant to plan for all eventualities, but I don't think we planned for that. Oh, you're all right.
Most important thing, are your knees all right?
Oh, that's the fastest Okay, standing is a good option. God, where were we up to?
I've lost my train of thought.
Oh, I expect it's 110 kilograms that was the issue.
That woke up everybody.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I was just talking about the occlusion. Just two strategies, the hypoxic environmental kind of stress, but also using other stresses such as occlusion training to squeeze out maybe an extra little bit of adaptation in your athletes. So two things which kind of I'm thinking of in terms of using with athletes.
Hey, John. we should talk about the brain. Because, we've talked a whole bunch about the body. But the stress recovery balance, I mean, that applies to the brain too, right?
That's critical.
I've lost my microphone.
It's probably one of the fights. Appreciate it. I appreciate that segue. Not necessarily the initial one, but that right there. Because I would... Certainly, I think what we're talking about is the same language. You're talking about there needs to be a recovery process, and typically and traditionally we've always had a training process. When we talk about the specifics of how we do it, matters quite a bit, and the techniques and tactics. And from my approach from the brain, is what I don't think we often do is make sure it's individually and centrally derived. And you talked a little bit about this. Does it meet the specific individual? Because often I find in sport, we're not training the N of one, the athlete right in front of us. So what recovery techniques drive the central nervous system to be able to move toward a recovery dynamic? It is not one size fits all. Never has and never will. So we should be testing that. Should be testing the idea of, does this provide recovery for the person? And you can test that from the brain. There's actually a signal in the brain that allows us to understand. It's called DC potential. EEG is actually AC current. Most of us know that from electricity in our house. But DC potential is actually direct current and lets us know the stability of the brain and how much energy does it have in its energy bank. And it's telling us about everything else downstream. Neuromuscular, cardiac, responsivity. But so looking at recovery as individual metric, and then certainly putting together a process with the proper techniques because we can influence the brain through the other systems. Muscle, we can influence it through temperature changes. The other thing I think is dosing. We are often, again, prescribing to the group as opposed to the individual. And so hormetic dosing is so vitally important. And in my work, again, the challenge is, and I realize it's a significant challenge of coaches, that you're training so many people. But it's try to get as close as you can to training the individual. So what's the dose? Everything can be poison. It depends upon the dose and the timing. And so that's where hormesis and hormetic dosing really is an important concept that we should really bring into our adaptation cycles as we get closer to the training process and what works for the individual. Let me see if I missed anything. Oh, yeah, of course. Again, I'm still caught up in two minds here. Is he okay? And what just happened?
You're the psychologist. Come on,
and to assess internal load. I think generally in sport we do a pretty good job of the external load at the elite levels, but it's the internal load, and that's going to that DC potential of understanding really from the brain, then understanding from HRV, and then understanding maybe from the enteric nervous system. Those sort of measurements really allow you to understand through the adaptation to your training cycle, how do we adapt? How do we change it? Because the plan is very variable. But I think those are the pieces.
Okay. Hey, thank you. I'm getting questions canvassing all three questions. I'm just going to hop on the ones that are relevant right in the moment now. So, Shona, a question about stretching as a recovery tool. What are your thoughts on stretching?
Great question. There's not a lot of evidence to suggest that it's worthwhile in the recovery period. Probably the time that stretching from the scientific perspective is most beneficial is not in that actual recovery time frame, but in other time frames within the week. So not to say that's not important to have a level of flexibility, especially for some sports. However, it seems like in the recovery period it's not as important as we originally thought it might be. Having said that, there are definitely some athletes who will say they feel more sore in subsequent days if they don't stretch in that recovery time point. So we kind of have two kind of schools of thought there, but I think that it has its uses and it has its place, but thinking about the timing is probably where it's where we don't have as much information as we'd like.
Okay, thank you. John, I think we should talk about injury. Yeah. So we had a really nice example earlier today from Brandon in kayak. Suffered significant trauma in a car accident, and through dedication and plain hard work and a good team around him, came back and competed at the highest level in his sport, which is tremendous. And it's really quite devastating for everybody, the athlete and everyone that works with him, when there is a catastrophic injury. And the tendency is to, focus on the knee, or focus on the ankle, or focus on the neck, right? But I don't know, are we getting that wrong? Should we be focusing on the brain first? Because it's quite a significant grief process that comes along with this injury, right?
Yeah, I wouldn't say in general we're getting it all wrong, but I think you're touching on there's much more to the process than what we're attending to. The sad part is there's reams of research in the area of psychological aspects and affective aspects of injury. And we have to really understand that every injury is a brain injury. We're designed to survive. If our periphery or any of our viscera has been changed in its ability to function, you are going to have downregulation into survival. And so you're absolutely right. We often are not looking at that piece. The other thing is the last thing that alerts the central nervous system then and the brain and its capacity to assess its functionality, because it's constantly reading back and forth into the neuromuscular system and the cardiac system and so on and so forth. Are you functional? Are you ready? Are you capable? That we have to really attend to. The last thing, or the last step of recovery, is emotion. And so an easy way to do it, and a lot of the literature talks about this, and this is the way I used to build systems into sports medicine. See, if you have to add an additional piece of seeing a sports psychologist, that can be helpful. But we work at prevention levels. And I know the team here does too in their thoughtful ways. So if someone goes into sports medicine, have them do something that regulates their autonomic nervous system, gets them calm, because actually they're more open to treatment. They're more open to receive treatment from physiotherapists, and more able to be manipulated from a neuromuscular or a capacity to receive treatment. They're actually pain thresholds go up. And so again, they can receive treatment and kind of work through it. The other thing is exiting treatment in physiotherapy or from athletic injury, you should be doing something that regulates the autonomic nervous system. We used to make a Chinese menu, depending upon the time. How much does the time the athlete have before they get into treatment? And what do they like to do? And you mentioned one of them, music. Regulate through the inner ear, which is millimeters away from the vagus nerve, so it's going to have control to the brain, calm the heart rate, calm the gut. And then we'd have longer. Do a float session post. So it's critically important, and often we're not. And this is why we see ruptures. Someone will return, and they'll have another injury very soon after that, is because often the pattern recognition and the affective centers of the brain are not ready for that load, because it's traumatic. And that trauma has not been worked through. Yeah. It's very thoughtful, but it's actually pretty easy to weave together into a process.
Are there any gender differences, when an athlete, the question just says stressed, but, Any thoughts?
I mean,
on
there
any
are
differences?
differences in the human brain between men and women. They're not as vast and as great as any of us like to be. Like men aren't from Mars and women aren't from Venus. Let's just be clear about that. So I would say no. But what I'd say the diversity is actually through the eyes of the athlete, and that's what we do, I think, in applied psychology and sports psychology, is try to understand, and as you guys have talked about, understand the strengths that the person's coming with. Because amazingly enough, when you get into a trauma state, you may move away from the things that you normally did that enhance your neural resiliency. So to bring that back to the surface, and then add tools in for effective management where need be. But it's not across gender lines. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Shona, we talked about monitoring sleep early on, and certainly with injury and pain, sleep can really disintegrate, and that's a shame because it's probably when we need to sleep deepest the most, right? Physical repair, but just in a general sense, what should we be thinking about in terms of monitoring the athlete, in this really vulnerable time?
Yeah, I think that's, again, a great question. I think, obviously, the psychology is incredibly important, and probably, and me not being a physiotherapist or a doctor, I would say, one of the most important aspects is the psychology. But I think, some of the things that we've learned from the monitoring data that we've collected over the years is that if athletes are doing 80% or more of their training sessions, they're 7 times more likely to get their PB that they've highlighted at the start of the season, which says just don't be sick and don't be injured. If you can train 80% or more of the time, you've got a significant chance of doing what you need to do. So the thing is that, 1, we need to monitor what they're doing going into that injury, and then 2, we need to monitor what they're doing coming out of the injury. I don't really believe in injury prediction or injury prevention, but I think we can go back and take a look at what has happened to try and make sure that that potentially doesn't happen again. And there are, tools that we can use from a monitoring perspective. I always like the story of how I wasted a lot of money in my PhD. My PhD was in overtraining. Did some big studies, stable isotopes, hormones, measured everything under the sun. The best predictor of how their performance was going to go was subjective information, pen and paper. So I wasted a lot of university cash. But I think asking them questions and creating an environment where they're willing to give good and accurate information becomes really important. So I think we need to monitor some subjective things. We obviously, if we can monitor their load, their external load, depending on what the sport is, and then when they're in this phase, obviously I think sleep is a really important thing to monitor, because if they're not sleeping, then they're probably not going to be recovering as well as they could. But learning from what they've done leading in and monitoring leading out, again, so that we've got some numbers and we understand what we're dealing with.
And you just mentioned the word overtraining. I mean, Andy, if I jump to you, is there such a thing as over-rehabilitation? I mean, how much is too much, or how much is enough, when the athlete starts getting active, moving through their rehabilitation phase?
Yeah, got to be careful what I say here. I'm not a rehab specialist, but certainly, as Shona said, if you don't measure and you don't monitor, then you don't know where they've been, and you've got to kind of keep a check on that and try and get a feel for why they're in the position they're in. So this all comes down again to load monitoring and how they come out of the other side. In terms of that return to play, return to train, and as they go through those kind of phases. So certainly from my experiences, getting good kind of monitoring data is critical for across all the disciplines who are working with athlete, from physiology, S&C, medicine, physio. And when you case manage an athlete back from injury, then you're obviously all putting those pieces as part of that puzzle. And there's been some nice kind of research showing what the risks are of returning athletes to training. If they do too much too early, what is the chances of them re-injuring in terms of triggering another injury in their injured part. So certainly that load monitoring comes into the piece there. Often the workload issue over the last kind of 12 to 18 months has been this acute chronic workload ratio, and that's been spouted around as being, is there a sweet spot? Is there an injury risk area? So there's been a lot of kind of debate and reluctance, acceptance of that kind of as a model to prevent or avoid injuries. And there's a nice review came out recently. Well, not a review, I guess a piece by Tim Gabbett looking at the kind of the myths of the acute chronic load ratio. So I certainly encourage you to have a read of that. It was more of an educational piece. I think that the acute chronic load ratio has been maybe a little bit misinterpreted, which sometimes can happen in scientific research, but certainly have a read of that, and that might give you a perspective on how to interpret acute chronic workloads.
John, what about the mental fatigue of rehabilitation? I mean, at a nutritional level, often we say that the nutritional needs of a fit athlete and an injured athlete are almost the same, barring the fuel that you put in terms of carbohydrate. But any strategies for mental fatigue through the rehabilitation phase?
That's a great question. I want to touch on the piece of the acute-chronic ratio. Bannister's work is phenomenal, and it seems like there has been some misinterpretation of it because he even talked about total load, which is even more important now, looking at lifestyle of our athlete. The brain energy bank does not shut off when they leave the facility. And in fact, it's constantly monitoring the balance of energy it can provide. And we're constantly working towards adaptation. And I think that's one of the pieces I've seen in Gabbert's work that it's funny that he wrote that. I think he's added more to the myth than anything. That's my strong opinion on that. But because Bannister's work was really ahead of its time, that was 1970s, and really talking about there is something to this central load, and that's when I've talked about that overall load is pretty critical. And then going back to your question, I think this is where we go into those exercises that have to do with any time we create more flexibility in our autonomic nervous system. We all probably learned that the autonomic nervous system was antagonistic. We had this side in which we energize and the side in which we can recover. That actually is completely false. It is not that simple. It's actually very complementary. And so anytime we create more flexibility in exercises where we can excite and get relaxed, we're creating an adaptation in which we can move. If we think about it, if anyone in this room flatlines, what happens? You die. We're designed for variability. So the autonomic nervous system was designed for variability in and of itself. So a way to help with the mental load, and I don't like that term because we don't know what that is. We don't know what consciousness is. It's really brain load, is to create flexibility in the autonomic nervous system. So, and in our environments, typically, we're not activating parasympathetically. But we do need to activate sympathetically as well. But our athletes get enough of that. So we have to work both sides so they start to become more coherent and more flexible. Probably for those of us in a life-work balance, is where it looks a little bit different. But for our athletes, it's managing that parasympathetic side and activating it a bit more. Yeah.
And in terms of monitoring or measuring autonomic nervous system status, there's a fascination in the room about the NFL. And any chat about wearables in the NFL to measure internal load and what's happening in the CNS?
Well, there's certainly, if you follow the popular press, Whoop is the gift from God that keeps on giving, but it is not. There's a lot of problems with the technology. Initially, it's a lot of innovative idea. Let's look at recovery. Let's look at some of those internal loads. However, there's a thing in technology across all the wearables and sometimes even the nearables. There's a choice about battery life. And how much battery life you choose is how much sample you can get of biometric data. And when you look at certain biometric data needs, you need a lot of battery life. Whoop chose to make something that looked really nice on the wrist. It wasn't a brick. And so they chose battery life that cannot access the HRV data that we need to really prescribe internal. But also HRV is not as accurate without EEG, brainwave. So I think probably if I talk about some of the things, it's a collection of clinical grade devices in which you bring a signal down into a dashboard to really understand it. One of the things I mentioned earlier, which I'll mention, is the omega wave. Yes, you can get DC potential from many other ways, but omega wave with a 7-minute read can allow you brainwave understanding about readiness, and then matching that with HRV clinical grade allows you to understand the functional systems of readiness. So that's something I use exclusively with New England and elite military. Now, when I started, you had to wire someone up, and they all wanted their picture taken with it, like the pictures you guys had of athletes with being all wired up. Now it's quite easy. It's done with an EEG band, and then one lead to the brain, and using our smartphones, because for most of us, they have more power than the first 3 laptops we had. And then it downloads to a database. Now there are other metrics we need, but if we don't get the brain, we're not starting from the lead. So that's one used quite exclusively. Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
Shona, just jumping to you, the question coming in around massage, you know, when sympathetic drive is really high and we're stressed, you know, people often think, yeah, I'll go for a massage. So thoughts on the effectiveness of massage? We talked about stretching before, jump to massage now.
Yeah, another interesting one in terms of its use in purely for recovery. There's not a lot of evidence to say that it's effective in that pure recovery period, with the exception of if you have a reasonable amount of muscle damage. There's some now models. Anyone who is interested in this should read some of Thomas Best's work out of the UK. He's used some animal models, but now he's moving into human models and looking at how muscle can potentially repair through soft tissue therapy. But generally, you know, we always thought, oh, massage, you know, helps you clear lactate. It's like, yeah, right. It doesn't. If you want to clear lactate, do an active recovery, and do you really need to clear lactate? Unless you've got another event happening within, you know, half an hour to an hour, you probably don't need to worry. So I think this focus on lactate kind of sent us down the wrong path. And the idea is, you know, now people look at massage purely as a recovery strategy, so between 2 efforts. Unless it's a very, very short period of time, there's really no benefit as a pure recovery strategy. I am a believer in sort of the same thing with stretching. I am a believer in soft tissue therapy at different times in the training week. I think there's some benefits there in maintenance and injury prevention and treatment of injury. I think there's definitely some benefits there. John will know more about this than me, but I know there's some evidence around, you know, stress response and reducing stressfulness and the benefits of touch, and, you know, there's a whole other side of, you know, benefits of massage from my understanding. But purely as an acute recovery strategy, probably not that beneficial, but definitely beneficial in other phases of the training plan.
Okay, here's a question for you then. What about cupping? I've not seen as much cupping. It's probably owed to the, you know, where I live now, but we saw it in Michael Phelps as well. Very fashionable.
Thanks,
He started
Michael.
a wave in Rio, didn't he? Thoughts on cupping, Shona?
Yeah, look, waste of time and money. Not a lot of evidence, zero evidence that it's effective. Some people like it, and they feel, you know, we cannot discount the belief effect, because the belief effect is important. But from a recovery performance perspective, nothing.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I'm just going to reinforce a lot of what you said, and you kind of you winked there. You brought up something. I think again we often have to think of timing and dosing. Everything can be poison. And so massage, again, often what is done, and what we see within the enteric nervous system as well as the brain, we're not moving tau proteins by doing that. We're advancing them. And so we're increasing inflammation on top of inflammation, so we're not getting clearing. So what we're naturally doing is interfering with the natural brain and body ability to clear toxins. So we're damaging our own hormesis. The other piece of I'll bring up technology here, and I hope it's not made it here, but if it does, I'd like to offer a warning. So these cryo chambers. So cryo chambers, you're basically standing up in a chamber. It's about 250 degrees below zero. You're in there for about 3 minutes. You might have seen it. We had a number of LeBron James was using one, I think, too. Not this last final, but the final before that. Not only do they do nothing, they do harm. So we've had 4 people die in them. And actually, they stop mitochondrial reactivity. So if you go in, we do a session, and we go in, it basically shuts down a lot of the growth and the growth signals that you would have had from that, session. So again, one of the things we've learned a lot in psychology is that just because you have an intervention and do an intervention, it doesn't mean that it will do good. It sometimes can do harm. And so that's, we have to be very thoughtful about these interventions.
Andy, anything to add on cupping?
Cup of tea.
There are a lot of questions on heat, which is not surprising because, you know, that question is starting to pick up momentum now building into Tokyo. You know, heat production is a rate limiting step to human performance, isn't it? So, you know, Andy, I might jump to you first on this question because I know you have an avid interest in heat stress and athletic performance. Yeah, how are athletes going to deal with this? I mean, can they harness it to their benefit, and how are they going to deal with it in the moment? You know, I understand this is a sensitive area for you as well because you're doing some pretty cool deep research back in NZ on this, so just say what you can. That's okay. Yeah, we'll listen with open ears.
Yeah, yeah, Tokyo is certainly going to be a challenge. I think that's pretty well known, and I'd like probably put the pressure on you guys and say you've got an advantage over many of the nations, certainly from what I've experienced over the last few days. But yeah, I think you've got to deal with it. You've got to get in that mind frame, and it's no different from other people. If you're an athlete, you just the way you approach it mentally is going to be, I think, a key thing. But from a physiological perspective, making sure that athletes are well acclimated to, you know, what's going to be pretty extreme temperatures if it does turn out to be as hot as it potentially can be. So certainly from our perspective, it is definitely a prepare for the worst, hope for the best case scenario in terms of the kind of expected temperatures and humidity. We've done a little bit of research with, you know, athletic groups over the last, you know, couple of cycles in terms of trying to acclimate athletes. And I guess one thing that we kind of often think about is, you know, is heat as a stress. You know, and athletes are already getting stressed through the training stress, the training load, and then you start layering in the fact that an Olympic Games is coming up, and then you want them in the heat. Then we just build the stress and the stress and the stress. So I guess one of our approaches is, you know, how do we give heat acclimation without over tipping them and tipping them into a kind of an illness, injury kind of scenario. So we've done a little bit of work looking at, you know, practical strategies to do that. So we've published some work which I've kind of got up there from Julia Casadillo's PhD, and some work we did with sailing around reacclimating athletes, or certainly acclimating them earlier than you would normally acclimate prior to a hot event, but then coming back to the heat exposure periodically in order to get the stress but not too much stress, and we found that to be kind of beneficial in maintaining some of the key adaptations to heat stress. So yeah, it's going to be a challenge, but you know, the classic strategies, I think, as nutrition say, you know, they take a food first approach. I think with heat strategy, you know, I think the best thing you can do is get out in the temperature and get used to it. It's going to be pretty hard to simulate it in chambers and other bits and pieces, although those are important tools to use. I think living in a hot and humid place is going to be the key.
Mm. So, I mean, are you suggesting that we're actually at an advantage because at a basal level we're subjected to higher environmental heat as opposed to New Zealand? I mean, what about the New Zealand athlete, for example, who, you know, it's kind of cool in NZ. Are they in an advantage because they can train harder for longer in a cooler environment, and, you know, the brain doesn't put the brakes on quite as quickly? I mean, do they potentially get more gains and then top them up with heat, or is it better just to live in the heat full time and adapt that way?
Yeah, I think there's two ways you can approach it. You're right there. Training in the cooler or more temperate environments allows you to, you know, do more work potentially, whereas training in the heat, you've got to regulate that, and there may well be a limiting effect. But as Shona mentioned earlier on, you know, harnessing heat to augment physiological adaptation is a good thing. Certainly the research is starting to show that it could be beneficial. So I think probably getting the mix. So I think periodization of heat exposure could be a key consideration throughout the year, not just when there's a hot Olympics on the cards. Using heat as a training tool I think now is fairly well, or the potential of it is fairly well known. But in terms of the New Zealand athletes, then yeah, it'll be the middle of the winter, so they're going to need to travel into a fairly hot environment, maybe sooner than Singaporeans might. But certainly, getting the athletes to start to feel comfortable in a hot environment is going to be the key, and not just the event. I think not just the time in which they're doing their event, but that there's 24 hours in a day, and their event might only be for an hour of that. What is the effect of the heat exposure moving between the athlete, or throughout the athlete village, and other travel like they might have to do? You know, we're just trying to educate athletes as well as support team on you know, overexposure to heat and what that could be, how that could manifest in performance.
Andy, what do you think we'll see countries doing in between, you know, multiple competition events in one day? Think about our rugby sevens girls at Asian Games. In between the matches, I mean, they were really struggling to lower the core body temperature. And I've seen a few funky things happening around the world. When I was working in rugby sevens, people experimenting a lot in this space. Thoughts on what we might see in Tokyo around that? Yeah, I think we talked about Shona talked about water immersion a little bit earlier on in the Q&A session. But I think, you know, if there is going to be scenarios where you do need to cool your athletes, then, you know, cold water immersion is probably the most effective way of doing that. So you kind of get a double benefit in that you get a little bit probably acute recovery as well as getting that core temperature down between games. So that's going to be an effective way. You know, we've talked about ice vests, you know, the hydration aspect, using slurries, cold water. Then these are all kind of cooling aids which will get your athletes probably feeling a little bit better about themselves after being toasted in the hot sun and humidity. But as for a new widget or a new gadget, I haven't seen or know of any yet, which is going to kind of provide the magic to everybody's potential problem. I think just good old common sense will prevail. Shona, can I invite you into the conversation? Australia really, you know, led the world for many years in understanding, you know, the impact of heat stress on athletic performance and how athletes, you know, before and during competition can manage that. What's going on in your neck of the woods around heat and Tokyo?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think when I think about heat, I always go back to Roger Federer. He plays in the Australian Open in January in Australia, and it's always hot, and he always does very well. And if he has a choice of what time to play, he wants to play when it's hot, because he sees that as an advantage, because he's done the work and he's spent the time, usually in Dubai or somewhere over Christmas, doing the work. So he sees heat as an opportunity, and that's the way that we try to look at things. Is if we can do things smarter and better than other countries, we're going to have a real advantage. So rather than stressing the athletes out too much by saying it's going to be hard, be careful. I mean, yes, they're going to have to be careful, but let's look at the things that we can do with them to help give them the confidence that they're going to be okay. So, I mean, the typical things that we've always done is everything that Andrew just mentioned, the water immersion, the ice vests, the slurries. But I think what it's about for us is also using test events, using any competition that you're going to have in Tokyo as an opportunity to trial things. So an example, we're quite lucky in Australia. Northern Queensland is hot, it's humid. We can have a lot of our pre-departure camps there and then head almost straight up with almost no time zone change. So we've got a quite nice situation in terms of preparing for Tokyo. But using every opportunity that comes along to try things and practice things. If you're going to use some pre-cooling strategies, really make sure that your athletes have practiced it, experienced it, tried it in competition. Is the equipment going to, you know, it's all well to have an ice bath. Can you set it up at the venue? Can you set it up where you need to set it up? If you can't set it up at the venue, where are you going to set it up? How do you make that timing work then? If you've got to travel a distance to the venue. So I think it comes down to exactly what Andrew says. I don't see any new fancy widgets, but what I see is we need to really refine our practices with individual athletes so that they have the best advantage that they can leading into it.
John, just thinking about the brain and heat, I worked with All Black Sevens teams for many years, and the coach, Sir Gordon Titchens, actually used to put a big emphasis on mentally preparing the players to step into a hot arena. Sevens World Circuit is predominantly played in hot environments, Scotland withstanding, and I just wonder what your thoughts are on the brain and heat, because there's a lot going on there, isn't there?
There is, and then really to touch on, and again, point out to everyone what we're doing up here is transdisciplinary, and we really all should be looking to do that and work as a team, because one of us has all the answers, but working together, we can put together a program, a protocol, an intervention that's far more specific and precise. And so I'm enjoying this, and again, I think when we do this in sport, it just works much better. You know, back to the brain, I think this is where we all connect. The brain doesn't run very well, when you're dehydrated. If you go to that next slide, I think, or my slide, and show you a cross section. Yep, that's a cross section of a CAT scan. So basically, you don't ever have to see a CAT scan before. What happens is you're making the brain work harder at something that an athlete has done and been able to train to do in such high efficiency. And why is that? Because the blood is bringing nutrients, vitamins, minerals, glucose, and neurotransmitters. And now you've turned a superhighway into a country road that is not paved and full of potholes. And so what you have there is the inability of the athlete to do the things they've trained to do: see, do, feel, communicate. So it's critically important. And I think from a standpoint that you guys are talking about, process is very important. I think in having a process of simulation, readying, know that you have a program that works, is the behavior change that our athletes are often not hydrated. Across the world, hydration, because of the advent of more caffeine, I don't know about here, but they have candy bars in the U.S. that have caffeine in them, equivalent to 2 cups of coffee. And it's not a big candy bar. So there's so many other ways in which we can load ourselves with things that rev up our system, or sympathomimetics, as we call them, that we're revving the system. And so with that kind of idea, we have to think about behavior change and getting them to drink. And then we have to look at how can we create a system of reminders. That's an important piece. And you guys had talked about nudging, and you and I were having a conversation afterwards about that idea is alive and well in the addictions research. How do we use a smartphone to text people at the time when a craving is going to happen or an intervention has to be happen to move towards human resiliency and health? And so in some ways there is some technology out there, but every one of your athletes has got a smartphone. And you can send text to them about reminders to drink. And what we see from the research in that area, if you meet them where they live, and we all live with our smartphones, so let's use them as tools as opposed to a nightmare that they are in some ways, at least for the brain, that if you text them, they will enact on it. And so getting that hydration level up is real important. And then I know I'm going to want you guys to jump in here. But it's not just water, because we know if we certainly take red blood cells and we dilute them, now we're no better. And so you want to add anything on that, please do, guys. I'm jumping a little bit into blood physiology here.
Well, is that coming out of NASA? Because I just spent some time up in the States, and in the hot regions around Texas, they use a really, really salty, it looks like an energy squeezy, but it's a really, really salty substrate. Yes. I think it's called Just Right.
Yes.
And it's actually got a little badge on it saying designed by NASA.
It was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you tell us? Do you know anything about that?
I do know a little bit about it. It was actually also tested with the elite military through DARPA. So that's, again, our research arm. They have to be looking at how DARPA initially, as a science and NASA, they were initially about, okay, let's design things to create weapons. But that changed in the post-Vietnam era. It was all about how do we protect individuals. So DARPA is all about how do we protect the individual who may be doing extreme jobs. And so basically what they were seeing with this cross-section of the CAT scan is that in extreme environments of low gravity, where you're also not getting the same type of pulsation and the same type of movement through the brain, that they needed more salt to actually create a dynamic of viscosity in the blood, move it through the system. And so that's where it came from. But the add-on effect is what we all know. Sweat is not sweat. Jump in here at any time. That we know that. And so some athletes may be losing aspects of dense nutrients they need for the system to run properly.
And it also activates a really strong thirst drive, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And the problem with the brain is, jump in here at any time. 1% is where, at 1%, water loss is where we're starting to lose capacity, starting with the brain noticing it. But this is one area where you say, okay, the brain could be a little bit better. We don't register thirst until we're at 3% water loss in our system. And then at that point, we're now, unfortunately, really trying to play catch-up, especially in endurance sports. Yeah. But it did come through NASA because we saw in a zero-gravity environment, there were things we didn't account for. We should have thought about it. Hydration is pretty important because it's pushing blood. So we have to make it thinner to get it through the system, because just as the zero-gravity, it's pushing it in different ways than it does with gravity. Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
Nice. And John, you mentioned the concept of cross-collaboration, and that's really what we're doing, and we're sharing with everybody in the room. But I mean, it's wonderful as professionals to cross-pollinate ideas and ask each other questions as well. So, and I love it when a panel goes ballistic and they just start take my job off me. So, yeah, if you've got any questions that you want to ask of each other, it'll keep things trickling on. I think we've got about another 15 minutes. So yeah. Were you going to say something, Shona?
Oh, I was just going to say, I think that an example, we had Commonwealth Games trials earlier in the year on the Gold Coast in Queensland, and it was pretty hot. And we had 2 athletes who were from the southern parts of Australia sent to hospital. And what they were doing, things that we don't think we should have to plan for, they were just spending too much time out chatting with their friends, with their other swimmers outside. It was an open pool, so they were just out, having a chat, and they'd spend way too much. They weren't thinking, okay, I need to do what I need to recover, then I need to get back to the hotel, and then I need to come back. We need to start thinking about the timing of when we're doing things, and it can be very, very simple, basic things like reducing the exposure of the time of exposure. Because you're exactly right, Andrew. When you look at the amount of steps that athletes can walk in an Olympic Village, it can be huge. 3 times a day to the dining hall, 2 times a day, maybe more, to the transport mall. They can just spend all. And if you're a swimmer, you don't walk. You don't walk anywhere. And so all of a sudden, you've got the heat exposure because it's all outside. You've got a whole lot of extra time walking. You've got the stress of being in an Olympic bubble with the rest of the world and all the world's media. We sometimes think about, and I do it too, I think about the ice baths and the 1%, and it's like, well, hang on, let's just look at simple athlete behaviours. We're doing a study with swimming now, and I can't believe we're doing it because it is seriously like 1980s research. But what we're doing is we're just tracking the swimmers. What are they doing for their warm downs and their recovery? And how long does it take them to get in the pool? And how long does it take them to get out of the pool? What do they do? And it's different. And it's chaos, and it's not all the same, and some of them take a heck of a long time to get in the pool and start their warm down. I mean, this is like recovery 101 from the 80s. But we don't have. We sometimes spend so much time looking for these 1%ers that we miss some of the basic stuff. And I think just taking an observational approach of what athletes are actually doing in competition. So we ask them, "What do you do?" Then before they before they went to the competition. Then we monitored them, what they actually did in their competition, and now we're looking at the differences between the two. So what they say they do and what they actually do is very different. They adjust their plans ad hoc, and now we're starting to have this information to feed back and say, we need a proper plan for you for Tokyo. And it sounds so basic that why don't we have this? I don't know why we don't have it. But now actually looking at behaviour versus what they say they do versus what they're actually doing. And that extra time and all those extra things that they're doing, when we know swimming finals in Tokyo in the morning, thanks America, then, we have, there's potential there for, for things to go wrong. Sorry, John, it's too easy.
It's low-hanging fruit.
I mean, it's that concept of rehearsal and visualising what you're doing. I mean, I know Phelps did it back in 2016 to the point where, he actually measured out, I think it was his coach's idea, measured out the steps, and they replicated, from the ready room to the pool, to exiting the pool, to going through media, to going to recovery, to going back to the ready room and back to the starting block again, to look at the impact of the load of that, but also just to get that rehearsal pattern, and it's that plan that you're talking about, Shona.
But I would say, again, what we're talking about is total load. That's really being thoughtful about that process. I've run into that and we've all discussed kind of the NCAA, the National Collegiate Athletic Association model, which by occupational health standards meets the definition of an extreme job. So it meets the same definitions we would give to pilots, air traffic controllers, coal miners. It is that extreme. It's a 70-hour work week job with multiple bosses, multiple commitments, your instability in your social life, instability in activities of daily living. And, analyzing some of the total load, we would see some of our nursing students or those on other clinicals in physiotherapy or teaching, in their training, training in, endurance sports or team sports or flow sports. And you would see this piece where they were really lacking the ability to adaptate. So we just started to manage the load outside of sport. Come to find the nurses are walking 10, 20K a day on a ward. Well, that's kind of an effect on recovery. So how can we mitigate these changes? Right? And most people don't get enough fiber. And so you can measure that and kind of be an assistance with that. And then what they've seen is taking in high profiles of natural yogurts, Greek and Icelandic, protect serotonin. And so what they found with people in one sample who were taking selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors and antidepressant that protect serotonin, their dose of their medication dropped just by this natural lifestyle. And this is where we're going to be going by scratching the surface with the enteric nervous system, is prescribing food in exact doses for the enteric nervous system and the central nervous system to work more and more in concert. So we would do that before mission-specific stuff, where people were going into trauma, increase the loading of that in their diet. The other was looking at 5-HTP, which is again a precursor to serotonin. So in why serotonin? It's not the only one we know about. It just seems to be the active bridge to everything else. And it seems to have such trauma, and cortisol seems to break it down so much. And if you're breaking down the channel to everything else, then we're not having things activate. So it's actually, we're talking about food as the drug. And food is drugs. It's just timing and dosing with it. And so it ain't illegal doping, and it's not brain doping. But it's smarter eating. It's getting the nutrients we need. And another reason why that's so important, and we were laughing about this earlier, there's a McDonald's in every Olympic village. That's non-food. That's not even food. Yeah, thank you. We invented obesity in the U.S. and then just sent it across to everywhere else. You're welcome. But if you think about that, their athletes are going to the Olympic Village to eat non-food, and so there's no way for them to upregulate neurotransmission. And so if we can take a different approach, and we can, that area is probably the most research of serotonin. Strategically, because it's anxiety and depression, worldwide concern, which we know depression, one of its major factors is inflammation. So what we're doing is breaking down inflammation through that process. We're protecting. Yeah. But I think Any of the other things, again, there are things in the neurotropic class that you can do with supplementation, but they're more for non-athlete sample, and that's the most research anyway. And I would be like you when you were talking about you could try these certain things, but yeah, we don't know what the knock-on effects are going to be. So I think for right now, it's sticking to those things, and those came out of extreme environments. Yeah.
And John, you mentioned there, I heard food, I heard fibre, I heard serotonin. And if there's one food on the planet that encompasses fibre and serotonin, it's kiwi. And Shona, I just think of that kiwi, powerful, break stools. And there's that sleep study, Shona, where people took 2 kiwi 1 hour before bed, right? And improved their sleep. So yeah, that's wonderful. My man there is holding up the 1-minute sign. That was a big session. That was like 1 hour and 20. Folks, thanks so much for hanging in there and really participating very heavily with the questions. I hope you all really appreciate what a privilege it just was to hear from our 3 experts. You don't get these sorts of opportunities very often, so please do put your hands together and thank them along with me.